Hello and welcome. My name is Miranda Jerry, and today I would like to talk about physical literacy. So let's jump right in. So, to start off, let's answer the question, what is physical literacy? Well, physical literacy is the motivation, confidence, physical competence, knowledge, and understanding to value and take responsibility for engagement in physical activity for life. Or someone who enjoys being physically active, wants to be physically active, and shows a certain aptitude for physical ability. According to the ECE Physical Literacy Handbook for York Region, there are three staples that make up physical literacy: motivation, confidence, and physical competence. To be physically literate means to have the motivation to want to do or want to try physically challenging skills. Do I want to run a 10K or chase after that ball? You also need to have the confidence to try these skills that can be very difficult or scary. Do I believe I'm capable of running a 10K? And lastly, you need the physical competency to complete these skills successfully without injuring yourself. Am I really capable of running a 10K? That being said, you can be physically literate and still get injured, but we will talk about that later. So, why is physical literacy important? When children are physically active on a regular basis, they are better able to focus and accomplish more in school. Physical literacy provides a healthy body that functions well for longer, which is part of your physical well-being. It's also fun. It's fun to work on unique skills and flips and handstands. The more capable you become, the more confident you are in your self-image and your abilities, which leads you to have less fear in your abilities and more willingness to try new things. When you consistently work on your physical literacy, you are more relaxed because you burn off energy, which gives you less anxiety. I would bet money that we all have met many children who have left us in the dust with the amount of energy that they seem to have. This is another reason why physical literacy is so important for children. They need to move. So now that we know the parts of physical literacy and why it's so important, I'd like to talk about the types of play that physical literacy is linked to. When we think about physical literacy, risky play, rough and tumble play, and fundamental movements are all part of building physical literacy. I first want to talk about fundamental movement, as these skills are crucial in physical literacy and allow us to be more competent, confident, in our physical lives. Things like agility, balance, coordination, and speed are just a few fundamental movement skills that attribute to physical literacy. Other fundamental movement skills like running, swimming, and throwing are also the foundations of bigger, more challenging physical activities. When you learn how to run, you can now start to participate in organized sports like soccer and football, which opens up a whole new world of cognitive, social, and physical development. So I made a video with my nieces demonstrating some of the types of physical literacy fundamental movements. It's not the greatest quality, but it's really cute and we had a lot of fun making it. And then afterwards, I want to explain the difference between the different types of fundamental movements because there are levels. Could you say physical literacy again for me?
Physical literacy.
Spell it. Physical literacy.
Physical literacy.
What was that?
Physical literacy.
Physical literacy.
Physical literacy.
Physical literacy.
Rolling. Throwing. Throwing. Catching. Catching. One out. Physical literacy.
was honestly so much fun, and they were so excited to do this. And hopefully, they learned something about physical literacy after having to yell it so many times. So, moving on. So this is a visual representation of Gallagher's theory of motor development. So we start with reflexive movement phase, which is all of the reflexes that we have when we're born, like sucking, closing your fists around something that is in your hand. This is when we decode and encode sort of what is around us, and we get an idea of our surroundings and what things do what. Then we move on to the rudimentary movement phase, which is responding to things like placed in your hand or more responsive. Then we move to the rudimentary movement phase, which is actually more of the responding when something is placed in the child's hand. This is the crawling, the beginning to toddle, and all of that stuff. And these first two stages, the reflexive movement phase and the rudimentary movement phase, are special because these skills tend to develop naturally through the children's natural environment, and they don't tend to need a whole lot of aid from us in the sense of learning by watching or having us do hand over hand. These skills tend to develop regardless. Next, we move on to the fundamental movement phase. And in the fundamental movement phase, these skills are not automatically developed. Children will need guidance when learning fundamental movement skills. If children do not learn these skills, it can hold them back from achieving special movement skills or moving on to the special movement phase, which is when you're learning to do things that are more useful in your everyday life, like learning to drive a car and understanding the spatial awareness of driving that car. So thanks to Gallagher's theory of motor development, this visual representation of it actually does a really good job of explaining how we gain our physical literacy and how we start to lose our physical ability despite having all of that knowledge. If you turn the hourglass upside down, all of the sand goes to the other side. And on the other side, we have lifelong daily living utilization, recreational utilization, and competitive utilization. And as we get older, those are sort of the three categories that we start to fall into with our physical literacy. Which brings us to risky play. So risky play is defined as engaging in thrilling and exciting experiences that involved a potential risk of injury, but more importantly, offers them opportunities for challenge, testing limits, exploring boundaries, and learning about managing risk. Risk tends to be very closely associated with the word hazard or danger, but risk and hazard are actually two different things. Risk is not solely tied to physical activity, actually, but it does have a role in developing physical literacy. Risk is the possibility of gaining or losing something of value with an intentional interaction with uncertainty and probability. Risk is subjective and can change or vary from person to person. Risk in play adds to children's physical literacy by allowing them to develop critical thinking skills. Should I jump off this tall rock or will I hurt myself? Being placed in situations that deliberately require children to assess risk is not just beneficial to their physical well-being, but life is and will be riddled with risk and risky decisions to be made. Do I decide to go to university or college? Do I decide to rent or buy? Hazard, on the other hand, is directly tied to the potential source of harm or danger. Hazard is what we are aiming to eliminate, even in the riskiest of situations. I think of a sport like gymnastics, where you are consistently putting yourself into situations where you risk injury. Yet gymnastics is still a legal sport, but it is because they have removed as many hazards as possible to allow for risks to be taken with low potential for injury. Both risk and hazard still have the potential for injury, but without exposure to risk and hazard, how will children learn to assess them when faced with challenges that are risky or hazardous? Both risk and hazard ask the question, what is my personal limit? Am I aware enough of my own abilities to successfully complete this task uninjured? If we never ask children to question risk or hazards, they may never learn to recognize true risk or hazard when faced with them. Lastly, we have rough and tumble play. So rough and tumble play refers to what most people might call play fighting. It looks like fighting, but the goal is not to injure anyone. Rough and tumble play might seem arbitrary to some, but it has its benefits and its place in physical literacy. So, whoops. So Jordan Peterson said, rough and tumble play is an excellent mode of socialization because it teaches the child the distinction between aggression and too much aggression. If you're trying to figure out how to configure yourself around others, if you haven't had that rough and tumble play, you don't really know what the boundaries of your body are. I feel that he makes a great point to understand your own boundaries, your own limitations. It helps to be made aware of them through someone else's guidance and help in a playful way. Isn't that the same formula we use in play-based centers when teaching anything from how to tie your shoes to the ABCs? Also, other mammals like dolphins and lions teach rough and tumble play as a way to assert dominance. Obviously, we don't do that. They also teach how to defend themselves or protect themselves, but also to build their physical literacy in order to survive in the wild. I'd like to go back to Jordan Peterson's idea of aggression and too much aggression. I believe what he's really saying is good adrenaline versus bad adrenaline. Rough and tumble play allows us to differentiate the boundaries, our own and what we will accept from others in a physical, emotional, and behavioral way. Good adrenaline allows us to think on our feet and have fast reaction times. It is the reason we take risks. Without good adrenaline, we wouldn't be able to parachute out of a plane or get the courage to hang from monkey bars. Bad adrenaline is closer linked to undesirable behavior like hitting, fighting, and yelling. This is less linked to physical literacy and more linked to self-regulation. Physical literacy doesn't mean you don't get hurt, but it does mean you are less likely to get hurt when engaging in risky or rough and tumble play. So I'd like to show you a video by Pamela Ford where she talks about why everyone should join the circus. And as someone who has run away and joined the circus, I can say she beautifully explains why physical literacy is so important, not only for our physical health, but also because it informs other areas of our development. I would like you to hear her talk about what she calls vertigo moments and why it has a large impact in our children's future. So let's stop sharing and switch over to this.
To show off together as a team. One teenager tells us that it was in circus that she got to make her first steps across a stage. Let me explain one more thing about that. When you think about showing off, you don't always think of it as a skill, but it is. Showing off is a skill, and it has to be developed. Another circus teenager tells us that it was in circus that he learned how to listen and to develop confidence in himself. One doesn't get to show off if one doesn't pay attention. One doesn't learn the trick if one doesn't listen. The motivations are great, and the rewards are even greater. Step back into your 10-year-old circus performer's mindset for a minute. You are walking on the high wire, or riding a unicycle? Are you taking some reasonable risks? You can probably feel it. Reg Bolton, a circus educator in Australia, tells us that all kids need to have their hearts in their mouths at least once a day. You probably remember some of those vertigo moments of your own childhood. Maybe when you jumped out of the swing, or when you were riding your bike hands-free down a steep hill, or when you took your skateboard off a particularly challenging ledge. Some children, when they don't have opportunities for vertigo moments, will look for them elsewhere. They'll experiment with drugs or alcohol, maybe street racing or unprotected sex. We are all too familiar with the results of those risky behaviors. I prefer to offer our young people an opportunity for vertigo moments in a circus setting. What can go wrong if you are taking reasonable risks within a circus? Circus, by definition, involves at least the illusion of risk. If you have worked hard to develop your body as well as your performing skills, then you already know how to avoid falls in the first place. And you know how to avoid injury if you do fall. You are mitigating the risks that you take through your own developing skills.
Wait, give me 1 second to get us back to our slides. There we go. Let's see. Studies show that when children are not exposed to risky play, they are more likely to become injured. Children who have limited adventurous or challenging play opportunities are less equipped to assess and decide what they are physically capable of accomplishing. In other words, they lack the physical literacy and are more prone to doing something that will leave them injured because they don't know any better. Children are more likely to do dangerous things if they have never experienced risky play. Being exposed to risky play is directly linked to physical literacy, and if you're physically literate, you're less likely to be injured. With exposure to climbing and, my notes moved. With exposure to climbing, jumping, and hanging, children learn their boundaries of capabilities, which allows them to better assess risky and hazardous situations. They are less prone to injury because their muscles and bones are strong enough to handle whatever they're doing. They also understand their limits better, and they therefore make better informed choices when dealing with risk. If you are not exposed to risky play, you do not possess the skills necessary to properly assess if you are capable to safely execute a skill, like jump down from a height and properly land. Now, for children with varying abilities, risky play is even more crucial, specifically for children with varying abilities that directly affect their muscle and bone tissue. It is extremely beneficial to keep their muscles from becoming tight and further hindering their range of motion. Obviously, with any child, there are precautions that need to be taken in order to ensure the safety of all children. But these precautions are usually linked to the lack of accessible playgrounds, which can sometimes render children with varying abilities unable to participate in risky play at all, which can prevent them from fully benefiting from the opportunities afforded by this kind of experience. So to end off this presentation, I'd like to show you a little video I made of the progression of walking. So let's share with you. All right, so I'd like to go over the progressions of learning to walk, and we're going to use my friend Jojo as our model. I filmed this with Jojo about a half hour before her bedtime, so she was a little bit less enthusiastic about doing all the things I needed her to for this video. All that to say, I did not get a shot of her demonstrating our first step in the progression of learning to walk, which is rolling over. So we're going to move on to our second step, which is lifting the head and pushing themselves up. Both rolling over and lifting the head / pushing themselves up requires muscle development and muscle control. The more they practice, the stronger they'll get.
Go ahead, Jeff.
The drug cartel commits violence and walks away.
Next, we see the adorable JoJo crawling to her favorite person, me, but actually she's not crawling to me, she's crawling to my phone because she's obsessed with phones because adults are obsessed with phones. She's obviously a little bit more advanced of a crawler, but for a very long time, she army crawled everywhere. And she actually only army crawled on one side. So she was stronger on one side at the very beginning. But this is where we start to see the motivation and desire to crawl come out. Obviously, in this clip, she had the desire to come to me or get my phone. Same with pushing themselves up. The motivation that we talked about earlier is to be able to see. The next stage in learning to walk is pulling themselves up to standing, as well as standing and balancing while holding on to something like a couch or a table or a caregiver.
About plans to build 3 new opioid treatment centers.
At this stage, children are learning to balance, and when JoJo first started to stand while holding on to something, she didn't fully realize that she had to hold on, so sometimes she would let go and just like fall straight back. So we used to put a bunch of pillows underneath her, and obviously would stand around her until she got to the point that she realized, I have to hold on or I'm gonna fall down. Some people might ask why we would put pillows under her. This is not a normal practice and should not be done in an ECE setting, or if you are looking after anyone else's children. Because I am the nanny and the parents have suggested this as a way to prevent her from hurting herself, but still improve her autonomy, it was a practice we did within the household while the parents were present. I never did this on my own because I never really needed to. That being said, we did assess the risk and decided as long as she wasn't close to anything that could be hazardous, like hitting her head on something, that it would be fine for her to fall on a soft surface. We are also all gymnastics coaches in the household, so learning to land safely is the very first thing that we teach children in a gym setting. Allowing JoJo to fail safely and independently informed her physical literacy, and eventually she stopped falling. But this is also kind of part of the risk and hazardous play we were talking about earlier. And experiencing this risk informed JoJo's physical literacy. So once children have mastered standing alone while holding on to something, they will start to cruise. This is when they will walk, usually sidestepping while holding on to something like a couch or a windowsill or a caregiver. Again, I didn't get a great visual of this from JoJo. She just was not having it with walking today or this day.
Walking. I just need you to walk for me. Why won't you walk for me?
I'm here to see Frank Hudson.
Whoa.
Tell him I've got information.
No, I know what you're going for. Yeah.
We're ready to push the U.S. military to intervene against the Venus cartel.
Hi.
But first,
But it's okay. You can kind of understand, and I'm sure you all have seen what I mean by cruising, sort of moving along furniture instead of walking fully on their own. Again, motivation helps. So placing a toy just out of reach. You can also do that when they're laying on their stomachs to get them to lift their heads or even to start to try and crawl. Placing things that they love or want just outside of their reach is going to motivate them to move.
you want them to go to war. It's a lot to think about, I know.
So next comes balancing freely. JoJo eventually did start letting go of her surroundings while she was standing. like I said before, she didn't necessarily realize at first that she had to hold on, but then it was like the pendulum switched the other way and she didn't need to hold on. Now she balances freely and even tries to stand up in the middle of the room alone.
Okay, okay. Yes.
Again, the motivation to stand is there. She's holding onto a phone. She doesn't even really pay attention to the fact that she's standing by herself. This is the point when we start to hold her hands and walk with her. Or, like I have in this clip,
Recording?
Nos vamos en 10 minutos.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Jojo really did not want to walk. I tried many times lifting her up and putting her feet down and holding her hands and getting her to walk, and she was not having it, probably because she'd spent the whole day doing that. So Jojo is not quite walking on her own yet. She has taken a few steps here and there by herself, but she doesn't quite have the balance or the coordination, as well as she has yet to find the confidence to take those steps. But she is so close and so cute.
Yes. Oh, he likes the beat.
Oh my goodness, she's so cute. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for coming and watching. And I hope that you learned something about physical literacy. I actually did learn quite a bit doing this project. Oh, here's my reference page. There we go. All right, thanks.